From the book of Proverbs, chapter 18, there I am. Book of Proverbs 18, verse 17 says, "He that is first in his own cause seemeth just, but his neighbor cometh and searcheth him." It's not always good to go with the first thing you hear. Sometimes you need to do some research and find out if what you heard at first was true. And many times, you find out that things aren't always as they seem. I believe that case is very applicable when we speak about John Calvin and Michael Servetus. Now, when talking about Christianity and politics, capital punishment, biblical law, should Christians be in favor of a state that puts criminals to death, or any political system in accordance to God's word? Should Christians be ashamed of that? Well, oftentimes, if you've been on the internet or you've had conversations with people, depending on what tradition of Christianity they come from, John Calvin and Michael Servetus comes into the picture. How does it come? It goes something like this. John Calvin murdered Servetus, had him burned at the stake. This is what happens when Christianity and politics mix. Now, what is my position on the matter? I believe that the vast majority of what most people have heard about the man John Calvin and his supposed sentencing to death of Michael Servetus is narratives derided by men who are no friends to the Reformed faith or Christianity in general. Much ends up being half-truths, if not total lies, about what really happened in history, and the accounts of Calvin and his treatment of Servetus that we end up hearing, television, classrooms even, usually end up making quite a straw man out of John Calvin. But whatever happened with John Calvin and Michael Servetus in Geneva? Many people today know that Servetus exists primarily for one reason, because he was apparently burned at the stake by John Calvin. Atheist Christopher Hitchens, for example, said regarding Calvin and Servetus, Calvin's Geneva was a prototypical totalitarian state, and Calvin himself was a sadist and a torturer and a killer who burned Servetus, one of the great thinkers and questioners of the day, while the man was still alive. But it gets worse. Writer Joseph Hartrup of Christianity Today states in his article titled "The Dark Side of the Reformation, John Calvin and the Burning of Heretics." He states, speaking of Calvin, though he remains popular and influential today, Calvin's involvement in this execution remains a dark mark on his past and an unforgettable reminder of how theology can turn sinister. The article later says, the glee of Calvin and those around him, like that Scottish reformer John Knox, at the death of a heretic remains deeply troubling, even with the historical accommodation granted. Could go on, but you get the picture. Atheists and many Christians today find much in common when it comes to viewing John Calvin and Servetus. But again, what really happened in history? Is John Calvin a murderer who ought to be disavowed by Christians today? Or is the modern and contemporary understanding of John Calvin and Servetus misunderstood by most? Well, spoiler alert, I believe it's the latter. But what really happened? Well, it was in Strasbourg that Michael Servetus traveled in 1531 to finish his book titled Denouncing the Doctrine of the Trinity. Servetus, you see, was an anti-Trinitarian heretic. He denounced Trinitarians, ironically, as atheists and expressed his sympathy with Muhammad and Islam. In one of his writings called On the Errors of the Trinity, Servetus wrote, "This tradition of the Trinity has, alas, been a laughingstock to the Mohammedans. He, Muhammad, says, moreover, that the apostles and the evangelists and the first Christians were the best of men, who wrote what is true and did not hold to the Trinity or three persons of the divine being, but men in later times added this." Michael Servetus was a messenger of heretical doom during the Reformation era. In 1531, again, the 20-year-old Servetus finished this book and sent it out throughout the world to both Catholic and Protestant countries, telling them that for 1,500 years the church has been wrong on the doctrine of the Trinity. He was bringing about the bright hope of Unitarianism, so he believed. Protestant reformers in Strasbourg, you might be familiar with one, Martin Bucer, were aware of this and they tried to persuade him of his errors. They eventually called for the ban of the sale of his book in Strasbourg, but they did allow him to live in peace. However, Catholic nations were understandably quite upset about this, and they had called for the arrest and execution of such an audacious heretic. Despite this, Servetus soon would return to the city of Paris. Now, understand, France during this time was very Catholic, a very bizarre choice for him to go there. Now, where does John Calvin come into this? Well, John Calvin had heard of Michael Servetus, and in 1534, he, at his own great risk, sought to meet with him in person in France, his home country. If there was anyone wanted just as much in France as Servetus, it was probably Calvin. He had already had to flee there a year earlier because of persecution. Calvin's intention was to meet with Servetus and address his grave errors and to, Lord willing, win him to the biblical Jesus, to the biblical faith. However, even though a time and a location had been agreed upon, when the time came and Calvin risked his neck to visit him, Servetus did not show. This was Calvin's first real attempt to win Servetus to the biblical Trinitarian faith. However, later in 1546, Servetus would begin to write to Calvin in Geneva. And this time, not only would he denounce the doctrine of the Trinity, but he would go on to eventually denounce the doctrine of original sin and its impact upon humanity. In his 25th letter to John Calvin, he wrote, "You say that the only thing God wanted to do with the law was to remind them of its impossibility. But I agree with the prophet that the observation of his commandments and of their fulfillments are as possible as his mercy." Now, what he was arguing for ultimately was this idea that you'll see appear throughout the church's history of Pelagianism. Going back to Pelagius, this idea that we actually can obey all of the law perfectly and be perfectly righteous if we just will to do it. Understand this, heresy usually begets heresy, where when somebody buys into a heresy, they're not going to just stop there most of the time, but as you see them, maybe you see them devolve in social media, wherever, they just adopt one heresy after another, and they get farther and farther away from the biblical faith, thus showing their true colors. That was Servetus. John Calvin responded to him, saying, "I neither hate you nor despise you, nor do I wish to persecute you, but I would be as hard as iron when I behold you insulting sound doctrine with so great audacity." He wrote that in a defense of orthodoxy in the Trinity from the errors of Michael Servetus. Servetus would write to Calvin at least 30 times in the next few years, in spite of Calvin insisting that he stop. However, eventually, Servetus would be found. He was hiding in Vienna, and he would be caught by the Catholic officials. Now, how was he discovered? Well, he was discovered through John Calvin. But wait, Calvin and Servetus have been writing to each other for years. Calvin never gave up his location to the authorities in Vienna until the Genevan City Council discovered that Calvin and Servetus were communicating, and they forced Calvin to give up Servetus' location. And that led to Servetus being arrested, and he would be condemned as a heretic in Vienna and sentenced to being burned at the stake. However, one of the great mysteries of history, April 4th, the night before his execution, Servetus managed to escape. How did he do it? We have no idea. But he escaped and he disappeared. But he has a second chance. Where is he going to go? Well, he goes across to Europe and he ends up in Calvin's Geneva. 4 months after his escape from the jaws of death, Michael Servetus came to Geneva and showed up at the very church that John Calvin had been preaching at. He explained that him being there really just happened to be a coincidence, that he just happened to be making his way through there while he was on his way to Naples. Now, the chances of that being coincidental, hopefully you understand just how ridiculous that is. This was clearly intentional. I hope that is obvious. However, what was Servetus doing there? Well, at this time, Servetus would come to where Calvin was preaching, and he would ultimately end up demanding that the city officials arrest Calvin as being the heretic. Because remember, he's been right the whole time. Not Calvin, not the Protestants, not the Catholics even, but Unitarianism. Perhaps Servetus had taken this opportunity because during this time, many of the libertines, who were many of Calvin's enemies in Geneva, they were getting quite a foothold on the Genevan Council. So maybe he thought that he could take advantage of that and deal with Calvin, who he considered his great foe. However, the problem with Servetus is that he was the most wanted heretic in all of Europe, and he didn't stand a chance. And when he appeared here, he was arrested and he was held to be tried for his heresies. Now, we are at the trial. Everything that we've heard has kind of been building up for this. At the trial, Calvin was summoned to reveal and reprove the heretical errors of Servetus in his writings. He was there as a witness to testify against Servetus and his heresies. He did not lead the prosecution. Geneva wasn't his kingdom where he sat on his throne and ordered all things to be happened. He was summoned by the council, and he did just that. He proved from Scripture the errors of Michael Servetus. During the process, Calvin would regularly visit Servetus also while in the evenings in prison, and he would continually plead with him to turn from his anti-Trinitarian and Pelagius errors and many other issues that you can look up if you want. All the while, Servetus would not listen, and he constantly was appealing that Calvin should be the one on trial. Well, on October 24th, 1553, the trial ended with Servetus being sentenced to death by the burning at the stake. Such a death was slow. It's actually perhaps one of the most painful ways that you could be put to death. I'd like to throw in biblical stoning as well, is also a painful way. At the time of the trial, it's important to understand, before I reveal what I'm about to reveal to you next, during this period in Calvin's life, Calvin was not yet an official citizen of Geneva. What does that mean? That means he was not legally allowed to vote either way in the trial. He was not allowed to vote. He had nothing to do with that sentence on a voting standpoint. However, Calvin and other Genevan ministers did petition to give Servetus a more humane death than burning. But their petition was denied. Did you know that? Did you know that? See, Calvin believed that death by burning was unbiblical and inhumane. John Calvin had no civil authority in this case. He was not a judge. He couldn't even have a vote. He was a pastor who was influential in Geneva at this time. It is true that Calvin believed, like many in his day, that the magistrates were duty-bound by the sword to suppress heresies. Yes, Calvin did believe that. But regarding Calvin's opinion on the matter of what should happen with Servetus, I'll read Calvin's words and what he wrote to Farel about it. He said, "I hope that the sentence of death will at least be passed upon him, but I desire that the severity of the punishment may be mitigated." Calvin didn't want anybody burned alive. And yet today, when most people think of John Calvin and Servetus, they kind of think like those quotes that I read to you at the beginning of this. Calvin sentenced the heretic to death by burning. Could you imagine Calvin laughing there, cackling with the fire rising up as Servetus screams for mercy? That's kind of the picture that's presented here. But as you've just heard, Calvin ministered to Servetus multiple times trying to win him to the faith, whether through letter or even in person. He even risked his life to meet with him. Calvin had warned on another occasion that Servetus shouldn't come anywhere near Geneva because he knew what would happen. The Genevan Council sentenced Servetus to death by burning. Calvin asked them not to do it that way. If anything, any way that's more merciful, that's not so inhumane, and he was denied that. And he's been accused of murder ever since. This is what's happened to John Calvin. And it's utter nonsense. So why do so many people, when they think about God's law being applied to a nation and capital punishment, why do so many people immediately imagine John Calvin cackling around a fire while Michael Servetus burns alive? Well, a couple reasons I'll give you. One is ignorance. They've heard that that's how it happened, and they just supposed it to be true. I mean, come on, you do that all the time. Someone tells you something, and you're like, oh, okay, then it must be true. Another thing is wicked slander. People who ought to know better, or in fact do even know better, slander Calvin's name and reputation by distorting the facts of history. I think there's plenty of atheists and, unfortunately, even Christian historians who do this. Number 3, malicious intent. They hate what Calvin wrote concerning the living God. Instead of dealing with Calvin's theology with an open Bible and an open mind, it's easier to build a straw man of Calvin the murderer, because at the end of the day, if he's a murderer, then why do we have to listen to him at all? Number 4, hatred of the biblical God. The reality is Calvin's just a man with an open Bible. God is sovereign. You're not. God is king. You're not. God's law is just. Man's law is not. What God says is. See, people hate Calvin because he was right. Humanism, the religion of our day, whether if it's atheistic humanism, theistic humanism, whatever it is, we're so baptized in humanism today. And humanism demands a God that everybody bends to their own will. Calvin taught no such thing because there is no such thing in the Bible. There's only the true and living God, and his law word is forever. He is the sovereign and good God, and we are but his people made in his image. Calvin did not murder Servetus. You've got to appeal to something else if you want to attack God's law being applied to any kind of nation in any kind of context. Thank you.